Julia Linden's hands trembled as she carefully piped a delicate rosette of cream onto the last eclair, her focus unwavering despite the morning rush that had already formed a line outside the patisserie's windows. She'd been up since 4, flour dusting her cheeks and apron, but the satisfaction of creating something beautiful made the early mornings worthwhile. "Perfect as always, Julia," said Margaret, the owner of La Farine Patisserie, as she flipped the sign from closed to open. "Those new rose eclairs will sell out before noon." The bell above the door chimed, and the first customer of the day stepped inside. Julia didn't look up immediately, arranging the display case with practiced precision. Only when she heard the now familiar deep voice did she lift her gaze. "Good morning. Black coffee and whatever pastry you recommend today." Ethan Hartwell stood at the counter in his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair slightly tousled from the October breeze. He was tall enough that Julia had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes with a strong jawline, and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He'd been coming in every weekday morning for the past 3 months, always at precisely 7:15, always alone, and always with the same order: black coffee and the pastry recommendation of the day. "Good morning, Mr. Black Coffee," Julia smiled, reaching for a fresh cup. "I have something special today. Rose cream eclairs. Just finished them 5 minutes ago." His eyes a striking shade of green that reminded Julia of the forest preserves outside the city crinkled slightly at the corners. "Sounds perfect, and it's Ethan, by the way." "Ethan," she repeated, the name feeling oddly intimate on her tongue after 3 months of customer-employee exchanges. "I'm Julia." "I know," he said, gesturing to her name tag with a half-smile. "You make the best pastries in the financial district." Heat crept up her neck as she handed him the coffee and carefully boxed an eclair. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Julia felt an unexpected jolt that had nothing to do with the temperature of the coffee. "6.50, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than it felt. He handed her a $10 bill. "Keep the change." "Thank you," she replied, tucking the bill into the register. "Enjoy your morning." He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary before turning to leave. Through the window, Julia watched him walk briskly down the sidewalk toward the towering glass building at the end of the block. "Who was that?" Margaret asked, appearing beside her with a knowing smile. "Just a regular," Julia replied, trying to sound casual. "Comes in every morning." "Hum," Margaret hummed skeptically. "And that's why your cheeks are matching the rose eclairs." Julia busied herself with the next customer, but couldn't help sneaking another glance at Ethan's retreating figure. Who was he? What did he do in that gleaming skyscraper? And why did their brief interaction leave her feeling so flustered? Little did she know. The man she'd been serving coffee to for 3 months wasn't just another suit in the financial district. Ethan Hartwell was the CEO of Hartwell Industries, one of the largest shipping and logistics companies in the country. And he just decided that black coffee and a pastry wasn't the only thing he wanted from La Farine Patisserie. Ethan stepped into the elevator of Hartwell Tower, balancing his coffee and the carefully boxed eclair. He nodded to the other occupants' mid-level executives who straightened imperceptibly in his presence as he pushed the button for the top floor. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," his assistant, Rebecca, greeted him as he stepped into the executive suite. "Your 8:30 with the board has been moved to 9:15, and the London office sent over the quarterly reports. They're on your desk." "Thanks, Rebecca," he replied, pausing at her desk. "Could you do me a favor? Find out everything you can about a patisserie called La Farine. It's about 3 blocks east of here." Rebecca raised an eyebrow but made a note. "Of course. Anything specific you need to know? Ethan hesitated. Just general information. Ownership, how long they've been in business, that sort of thing. In his office, Ethan set down his coffee and carefully opened the pastry box. The eclair was a work of art, delicate chew pastry filled with rose-scented cream, topped with a crystallized rose petal. He took a bite and closed his eyes, savoring the subtle flavors. For 3 months, he'd been stopping at La Farine on his way to work. He discovered it by accident when his usual coffee shop had closed unexpectedly. What had started as a convenient alternative had quickly become the highlight of his mornings. It wasn't just the exceptional pastries. It was her Julia. The way she concentrated so intently on her work, the flour that sometimes dusted her nose, the genuine warmth of her smile. In his world of corporate deals and bottom lines, she was refreshingly authentic. Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. La Farine Patisserie. Owned by Margot Dubois, French expatriate, in business 5 years. Very well reviewed. Anything else? He typed back. What about the staff? The response came quickly. Small team. Owner/head baker plus 2 full-time employees. One is Julia Linden, 26, graduate of Le Cordon Bleu Paris, pastry chef for 4 years. Ethan set down his phone, feeling a mixture of intrigue and guilt. It felt invasive to look into her background, yet he couldn't deny his growing fascination. Julia Linden was talented, formally trained in Paris, no less. What was she doing working in a small patisserie instead of a high-end restaurant or hotel? His thoughts were interrupted by the intercom. Mr. Hartwell, your first appointment is here. Ethan straightened his tie and closed the pastry box, setting aside thoughts of Julia Linden for later. He had a company to run. The next morning, Julia arrived at the patisserie at her usual time of 4:30 a.m. The city was still dark, the streets nearly empty as she unlocked the back door and flipped on the lights. This was her favorite time of day, the quiet hours before dawn when she could lose herself in the rhythm of baking. Today, she was experimenting with a new recipe, lavender and honey madeleines. As she measured flour and beat eggs, her mind drifted to her encounter with Ethan the day before. After 3 months of serving him as just another faceless customer, suddenly he had a name, a voice that lingered in her memory, and eyes that seemed to see right through her. You're here early, Margot said, arriving at 5:30 to find Julia already pulling a batch of madeleines from the oven. Couldn't sleep, Julia admitted. Thought I'd try something new. Margot picked up one of the shell-shaped cakes, still warm from the oven, and took a bite. Magnifique. The lavender is subtle perfect. These will sell out. By 7 o'clock, the patisserie was ready for opening, cases filled with fresh pastries, coffee brewing, and the intoxicating scent of butter and sugar permeating the air. Julia found herself glancing at the clock more frequently than usual as 7:15 approached. The bell chimed at exactly 7:15, and there he was. Today, Ethan wore a navy suit that highlighted his broad shoulders, and Julia felt her pulse quicken embarrassingly. Good morning, Julia, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice sent an unexpected thrill through her. Good morning, Ethan, she replied, already reaching for a coffee cup. Black coffee, and today I recommend the lavender honey madeleines. They're still warm. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Sounds perfect. As she prepared his order, Julia gathered her courage. So, what do you do in that big building down the street? Ethan hesitated, and Julia immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, that was nosy of me. No, not at all, he assured her. I work in shipping and logistics, nothing as creative as what you do. He gestured to the pastry case. Where did you learn to make all these? I trained in Paris, she said, handing him his coffee. Spent 2 years there after college. "Impressive," he said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "Why did you come back?" It was Julia's turn to hesitate. "Family reasons," she said simply, not wanting to delve into the story of her father's illness, the medical bills, the derailment of her career plans. "But I love working here. Margaret gives me a lot of creative freedom." Another customer entered, and Julia reluctantly turned her attention away from Ethan. "Enjoy your Madeleine," she said. "I will," he replied, leaving his usual generous tip. "See you tomorrow, Julia." As he walked out, Margaret sidled up beside her. "So, Mr. Black Coffee has a name, and he seems quite taken with you." "Don't be ridiculous," Julia said, but she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. "He's just being friendly." Hum, Margaret hummed skeptically for the second time in 2 days. "That man does not look at the pastries the way he looks at you, ma chérie." Throughout the day, as Julia served customers and prepared pastries for the afternoon rush, her thoughts kept returning to Ethan. There was something about him that intrigued her, an intensity beneath his polite demeanor, a sense that there was more to him than met the eye. Little did she know just how right she was. Ethan sat in his corner office, staring at the spreadsheets on his monitor without really seeing them. Instead, his mind kept drifting back to Julia's question. "What do you do?" He'd answered truthfully, if incompletely. He did work in shipping and logistics. He owned a company that controlled 20% of the country's commercial shipping infrastructure. The building she casually referred to as "that big building down the street" had his name on it, though the signage was discreet enough that she wouldn't have made the connection. Why hadn't he told her the truth? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Experience had taught him caution. His position attracted a certain type of interest, and he'd learned the hard way that revealing too much too soon often changed how people treated him. With Julia, the simplicity of their interactions was refreshing. She treated him like any other customer, with warmth and attentiveness, but no special deference. It was liberating. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Hartwell, the Tokyo office is on line 1. Ethan pushed thoughts of Julia aside and picked up the phone. "Hartwell speaking." For the next several days, a pattern emerged. Ethan would arrive at La Farine precisely at 7:15, and he and Julia would exchange a few minutes of conversation while she prepared his order. Each day, he learned a little more about her: that she had a younger sister in college, that she lived in an apartment 20 minutes away by bus, that she was saving to eventually open her own patisserie. In turn, he shared carefully edited details about himself: his love of sailing, his recent business trip to Singapore, though he didn't mention it was to acquire a shipping port, his preference for dogs over cats. On Friday, as Julia handed him his coffee and a chocolate orange tart, Ethan made a decision. "Julia, I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow night." The question caught her completely off guard. She stared at him, the coffee pot still in her hand, momentarily speechless. "I mean, if you're not busy," he added, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "No, I mean, yes, I mean." Julia took a breath. "I'd love to have dinner with you." The smile that spread across his face made her heart skip. "Great. Can I pick you up at 7? She nodded, quickly scribbling her address on a napkin. "I'm looking forward to it." After he left, Margaret gave her a knowing look. Not just a friendly regular anymore, Julia felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness flutter in her stomach. "It's just dinner," she said, but even she didn't believe her casual tone. "Ma chérie," Margaret replied with a laugh. "Nothing is ever just dinner when a man looks at a woman the way he looks at you." Saturday evening found Julia standing in front of her closet in a state of mild panic. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a pre-war building, was littered with discarded clothing options. She'd finally settled on a simple emerald green dress that she'd splurged on last year but rarely had occasion to wear. At precisely 7 o'clock, her doorbell rang. Julia took one last glance in the mirror, tucked a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear, and went to answer the door. Ethan stood in the hallway, looking devastatingly handsome in dark jeans and a tailored blazer. He held a small bouquet of ranunculus, her favorite flowers, though she couldn't recall mentioning that to him. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes warming as they took her in. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the flowers with a smile. "These are lovely." "How did you know ranunculus are my favorite?" A flicker of something embarrassment crossed his face. "Lucky guess. They reminded me of your pastries, intricate and beautiful." Julia felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Let me just put these in water and I'll be ready to go." As she arranged the flowers in a vase, she glanced around her apartment, suddenly seeing it through his eyes: the mismatched furniture, the well-used kitchen with its commercial-grade stand mixer, her one indulgence, the stack of cookbooks on her coffee table. It was homey but humble, a far cry from what she imagined his place looked like. "Ready?" she asked, returning to the door where he waited patiently. Ethan nodded, offering his arm. "I made reservations at a place I think you might enjoy." They walked to the curb where a sleek black car waited, not the luxury vehicle she might have expected, but a well-maintained sedan. Ethan opened the passenger door for her, a gesture that struck her as both old-fashioned and endearing. "So where are we going?" Julia asked as they drove through the city streets. "A little place called Terroir," Ethan replied. "It's a farm-to-table restaurant that opened recently. The chef trained in France like you." Julia's eyes widened. "Terroir. I've been dying to try it, but it's impossible to get reservations." Ethan smiled mysteriously. "I know the owner." When they arrived at the restaurant, Julia was surprised to be greeted personally by the head chef, who led them to a secluded table with a view of the open kitchen. "Mr. Hartwell, always a pleasure," the chef said, with a deference that made Julia glance curiously at Ethan. "We've prepared a special tasting menu for you and your guest this evening." "Thank you, Antoine," Ethan replied. "This is Julia Linden. She's a graduate of Le Cordon Bleu and an extraordinary pastry chef." The chef's eyes lit up. "Le Cordon Bleu? Which year did you graduate?" As Julia engaged in conversation with the chef about their shared alma mater, she couldn't help wondering about Ethan's apparent connections. How did a mid-level logistics employee have the pull to secure impossible reservations and receive such deferential treatment? Once they were alone, Julia leaned forward. "So, how exactly do you know the owner?" Ethan took a sip of his water. "I helped him secure the financing for the restaurant." "You're a banker too?" He hesitated. "Not exactly. My company sometimes invests in promising ventures." Before she could press further, the first course arrived, a delicate amuse-bouche that momentarily distracted her from her questions. As the evening progressed through course after exquisite course, Julia found herself increasingly enchanted by Ethan. He was attentive and engaged, asking thoughtful questions about her work and listening with genuine interest to her answers. When the dessert arrived, a deconstructed apple tart with caramel ice cream, Julia noticed Ethan watching her reaction closely. "What do you think?" he asked as she took her first bite. Julia considered the flavors. "It's good. The caramelization on the apples is perfect, but—" She hesitated. "But," he prompted, leaning forward with interest, "the pastry is a bit too dense, and there's too much cinnamon. It overpowers the natural sweetness of the apples." Ethan laughed, a warm, rich sound that made Julia's heart flutter. "Only you would notice such details." "Occupational hazard," she admitted with a smile. "I can't eat anything without analyzing it." "That's what makes you exceptional at what you do," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Your attention to detail, your passion, it shows in everything you create." The sincerity in his voice made Julia's breath catch. There was something so intense about the way he looked at her, as if he was trying to memorize every detail of her face. "Tell me about your dreams," he said suddenly. "Not just the patisserie you mentioned." What does Julia Linden want from life? The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked her that, since she'd even allowed herself to think beyond the next day, the next bill, the next batch of pastries. "I want," she began, then paused, gathering her thoughts. "I want to create something lasting, not just pastries that are eaten and gone, but experiences that people remember, moments of joy." She traced the rim of her water glass with her finger. "And I want adventure, to travel, to taste foods from different cultures, to never stop learning." She looked up at him, suddenly feeling exposed. "What about you? What does Ethan Hartwell want?" A shadow crossed his face. "For a long time I've been focused on building my career, my company. I've achieved more than I ever expected to." He paused. "But lately I've been wondering if there's more to life than spreadsheets and meetings." "And what have you concluded?" Julia asked softly. Ethan's gaze was intense. "That may be what's been missing, is someone to share it with, someone who sees beauty in the details, someone who cares more about the quality of what she creates than how much money it might make." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibility. After dinner, they strolled along the riverfront, the city lights reflecting on the water. Julia shivered slightly in the cool evening air, and Ethan immediately removed his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. The weight of it, warm from his body, felt like an embrace. "Thank you for tonight," she said as they walked. "It was the most incredible meal I've had since Paris." "Thank you for joining me," he replied. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed an evening so much." When they reached her apartment building, Ethan walked her to her door. In the dim hallway light, his face was half in shadow, but his eyes were bright and focused entirely on her. "I'd like to see you again," he said, his voice low. "Perhaps tomorrow. There's a farmer's market in the park. I thought maybe you'd enjoy seeing what's in season." Julia smiled. "I'd like that very much." There was a moment of hesitation, a current of anticipation between them. Then Ethan leaned down, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. It was brief, a question more than a demand, but it left Julia feeling dizzy with possibility. "Good night, Julia," he murmured, pulling away reluctantly. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As she closed the door behind her, Julia leaned against it, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. There was so much about Ethan Hartwell that didn't quite add up: his apparent connections, his mysterious company, the deference people showed him. But in that moment, all she could think about was seeing him again. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the farmer's market. Julia dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was putting the finishing touches on her makeup when her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Downstairs whenever you're ready. No rush." When she emerged from her building, she spotted him immediately, leaning against his car, scrolling through something on his phone. He looked different today, more relaxed in jeans and a Henley shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders. When he looked up and saw her, his entire face brightened. "Good morning," he said, straightening as she approached. "You look lovely." "So do you," she replied truthfully. "Very different from your work suits." "Weekend Ethan," he explained with a smile, much less uptight. The farmer's market was bustling with Sunday shoppers. Stalls overflowed with autumn-produced pumpkins, squashes, late-season tomatoes, and apples of every variety. Julia moved through the market with purpose, examining produce with a critical eye, asking vendors about their growing methods, occasionally purchasing items that caught her interest. Ethan followed, carrying her growing collection of purchases and watching her with evident fascination. "You're in your element here," he observed as she debated the merits of different apple varieties with a weathered orchard owner. Julia smiled, accepting a slice of Honeycrisp apple from the vendor. "I love knowing where my ingredients come from. The story behind the food matters." She held out the apple slice for Ethan to taste. He took it from her fingers, his lips brushing against her fingertips in a way that sent a shiver through her. "Delicious," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. They spent hours at the market, meandering from stall to stall, sampling cheeses, breads, and seasonal preserves. Julia found herself constantly surprised by Ethan's knowledge. He could discuss soil conditions with farmers, cheese aging with artisanal producers, and coffee roasting techniques with a local roaster. "How do you know so much about all this?" she asked as they sat on a park bench, sharing a paper bag of fresh mini donuts. Ethan shrugged. "I travel a lot for work. I try to learn about local food wherever I go. Plus," he added with a slight smile, "I read a lot." "Your job must be fascinating," Julia said, licking sugar from her fingers. "All that travel." Again, she noticed a slight hesitation before he answered. "It has its moments, but honestly the bureaucracy can be overwhelming." "Is that why you come to La Farine every morning, to escape the bureaucracy?" Ethan's eyes softened. "I come to La Farine because watching you work is the highlight of my day. Your focus, your creativity, it's mesmerizing." Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Now you're just flattering me." "No," he said seriously. "I'm not. You have a gift, Julia. The way you transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary, it's magic." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. No one had ever seen her work that way before, as something valuable, as art rather than just food. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." As the afternoon waned, they packed Julia's purchases into Ethan's car and drove back to her apartment. To her surprise, he carried the bags upstairs for her. "You don't have to do that," she protested as he followed her to her door. "I want to," he said simply. In her kitchen, Julia began unloading the bags, placing apples in a bowl, storing cheese in the refrigerator. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her with that same intense focus. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching his gaze. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I'd like to cook dinner for you here, tonight." Julia raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You cook? Don't sound so shocked," he laughed. "I'm not a professional like you, but I can manage. What do you say? Let me make you dinner with some of these amazing ingredients we found today." The idea of Ethan in her kitchen, cooking for her, was unexpectedly intimate. "I'd like that," she said. For the next hour, they moved around her small kitchen together. Ethan preparing a main course of pan-seared duck breast with an apple reduction, while Julia worked on a dessert, a simple tart with the Honeycrisp apples they'd purchased. There was something deeply comfortable about the domesticity of it, their bodies navigating the small space with an easy awareness of each other. Over dinner, accompanied by a bottle of wine Ethan had picked up at the market, their conversation flowed effortlessly. Julia told him about her childhood in the suburbs, her early fascination with baking, and her decision to pursue pastry professionally despite her parents' concerns about the financial stability of a culinary career. "They wanted me to get a real job," she explained. "Something with benefits and regular hours. But after my first day in a professional kitchen, I knew there was no going back." "And Paris, how did that happen?" Ethan asked, refilling their wine glasses. Julia's expression dimmed slightly. I won a scholarship to Le Cordon Bleu. It was a dream come true. I was supposed to stay in France after graduation. I had an offer from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Lyon. But you came back, Ethan said gently. Family reasons you mentioned before, Julia nodded. My father got sick, pancreatic cancer. I couldn't stay in France while my family was dealing with that, so I came home. She twisted her napkin in her lap. The medical bills were substantial. My parents had to remortgage their house. So after Dad died, I stayed to help Mom get back on her feet financially. And then my sister started college and she trailed off with a small shrug. Life happens. Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. I'm sorry about your father, and I'm sorry your dreams got derailed. They didn't, not really, Julia said, squeezing his hand. They just changed shape. I still get to create, to make people happy with my food. And working with Margaret has taught me so much about running a business, which I'll need when I eventually open my own place. You're remarkable, Ethan said softly. Most people would be bitter about the hand they were dealt. What's the point in bitterness? It doesn't change anything. Julia looked at him curiously. What about you? Have your dreams changed shape too? Ethan was quiet for a moment. I never expected to be where I am now, he finally said. My father was a complicated man, driven, successful, but not particularly warm. I spent most of my childhood trying to earn his approval. Did you earn it, I mean? A shadow crossed Ethan's face. I don't know. He died before I could ask him. Heart attack at his desk 3 days after I graduated from business school. I'm sorry, Julia said softly. After he died, I threw myself into the company, proving something, I guess, to him, to myself, I'm not sure. Ethan's eyes met hers. But lately, I've been wondering what it's all for. Success is empty if you don't have anyone to share it with. The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep in Julia. Impulsively, she leaned across the table and kissed him, a gentle, reassuring press of her lips against his. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. Julia, he murmured, his voice husky. You're making it very hard for me to be a gentleman. She felt a thrill at the barely restrained desire in his voice. Maybe I don't want you to be a gentleman. His eyes searched hers for a moment, then he stood, drawing her up and into his arms. This time when they kissed, there was nothing gentle about it. His mouth claimed hers with a hungry intensity that made her knees weak. She pressed against him, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. They stumbled to her small sofa, never breaking contact. Julia found herself beneath him, his weight a delicious pressure as his lips traced a path down her neck. Her body arched instinctively against his, seeking more contact. Ethan pulled back slightly, his breathing ragged. Julia, he said, his voice strained. We should slow down. Julia blinked up at him, momentarily confused. You don't want to? God, yes, I want to, he groaned, pressing his forehead against hers. But not like this, not rushed on your sofa. You deserve better. The consideration in his words warmed her heart even as frustration coursed through her body. I appreciate the thought, she said, placing a hand on his cheek, but I'm a grown woman who knows what she wants. Ethan's eyes darkened. And what do you want, Julia? Linden? You, she said simply. Now. With a groan that was part surrender, part triumph, Ethan captured her lips again. This time when his hands slid under her sweater, she didn't stop him. They undressed each other slowly, with reverent touches and murmured appreciations. When they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that took Julia's breath away. Afterward, they lay tangled together on her sofa, Julia's head resting on Ethan's chest, his heartbeat strong beneath her ear. Outside, the city lights flickered against the darkening sky. Stay, Julia murmured, not ready to let go of the moment. Stay the night. Ethan's arms tightened around her. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. In the quiet intimacy of the moment, Julia felt herself falling for this enigmatic man who looked at her as though she hung the moon. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered caution. There were still things about him that didn't quite make sense, but she silenced it. Whatever secrets Ethan Hartwell was keeping, she was beginning to believe they didn't matter. The next morning, Julia woke to the unfamiliar but pleasant sensation of a warm body pressed against hers. She opened her eyes to find Ethan watching her, a soft smile on his face. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, her voice husky with sleep. "A while," he admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're beautiful when you sleep," Julia groaned, burying her face in her pillow. "I'm sure I look like a disaster," Ethan laughed, pulling her back against him. "A beautiful disaster, then." They spent the morning in a lazy haze, making coffee, sharing the remainder of yesterday's tart for breakfast, and taking a long shower together that led to another round of lovemaking that left Julia's legs weak and her heart full. It was only when she glanced at the clock that reality intruded. "I have to go to work," she said regretfully. "Mondays are our busiest prep days." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I should head to the office too." They dressed in comfortable silence, stealing occasional glances and smiles. It felt surreally domestic, as if they'd been doing this dance for years instead of a single night. "I'll walk you to work," Ethan offered as they left her apartment. "You don't have to do that," Julia protested. "It's in the opposite direction from your office." "I want to," he said simply, taking her hand in his. They walked the 20 minutes to La Farine, talking easily about everything and nothing. When they arrived at the Patisserie, Julia hesitated at the back entrance. "This has been—" she began, then faltered, not sure how to encapsulate the whirlwind of the past 2 days. "Incredible," Ethan finished for her, pulling her close. "And it's just the beginning." He kissed her, a lingering promise that left her breathless. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," he said. 7:15 sharp. Julia watched him walk away, her heart lighter than it had been in years. When she entered the kitchen, Margaret was already there, up to her elbows in croissant dough. "Bonjour," the older woman called, then stopped, eyeing Julia critically. "Well, well, someone had a good weekend." Julia felt her cheeks warm. "Is it that obvious?" "Ma chérie, you are glowing like the sun," Margaret laughed. "I take it your dinner with Mr. Black Coffee went well." "It was perfect," Julia admitted, tying on her apron. "We went to Terroir." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Terroir? That place is impossible to get into." Julia nodded, remembering Ethan's casual explanation. "I know the owner." Another piece that didn't quite fit the picture of a mid-level logistics employee. "Margaret," she said slowly, "have you ever heard of a company called Hartwell Industries?" Margaret looked up from her dough. "Of course, shipping giant. Their headquarters is that big building down the street." "Why?" Julia felt a cold prickle of awareness travel down her spine. "No reason," she said, turning away to hide her expression. "Just curious." As she mechanically began preparing the day's pastries, her mind raced. Hartwell Industries. Hartwell Tower. Ethan Hartwell. It couldn't be a coincidence. If Ethan worked for Hartwell Industries, why hadn't he simply said so? Unless... The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. What if Ethan wasn't just an employee? What if he was the Hartwell of Hartwell Industries? Julia recalled the deference of the chef at Terroir, Ethan's casual mention of his company investing in promising ventures, his extensive travels, his obvious wealth despite his understated style. It all began to make a terrifying kind of sense. Had he been lying to her all this time? Pretending to be something he wasn't, and more importantly, why? The morning passed in a blur of activity as Julia worked on autopilot, her hands skillfully crafting pastries while her mind churned with questions and doubts. By the time the first customers began to arrive, she had worked herself into a state of confused anger. If Ethan was indeed the CEO of Hartwell Industries, why hadn't he simply told her? Was this some kind of game to him, slumming it with the working-class pastry chef? The thought made her stomach churn. At precisely 7:15, the bell above the door chimed. Julia looked up to see Ethan enter, a smile lighting his face when he spotted her. Despite her anger, her heart still leapt at the sight of him. "Good morning," he said, approaching the counter. "Black coffee and whatever pastry I recommend today," she finished flatly. "I know." Ethan's smile faltered at her tone. "Is everything okay?" Julia glanced around the busy patisserie. This wasn't a conversation she wanted to have in front of an audience. "Black coffee coming right up, Mr. Hartwell," she said, emphasizing his surname just enough to see recognition flicker in his eyes. Ethan's expression closed, a mask of control sliding into place that she hadn't seen before. "Julia, here's your coffee," she interrupted, sliding the cup across the counter. "That'll be $3. He placed a $10 bill on the counter. "Can we talk, please?" "I'm working," she said, her voice brittle. "Some of us have to be at our jobs at specific hours." Hurt flashed across his face. "That's not fair." "Neither is lying," she retorted, then immediately regretted her harsh tone as several customers looked their way curiously. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I never lied to you, Julia. I just didn't tell you everything." "Same difference," she said, pushing his change toward him. "I have customers waiting." For a moment, Ethan looked as though he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "I'll come back later," he said, "when you're less busy." "Don't bother," Julia replied, turning away to help the next customer. "I'll be busy all day." She felt rather than saw him leave, the bell above the door chiming his departure. Only when she was sure he was gone did she allow herself to exhale, blinking back the hot tears that threatened to fall. "What was that about?" Margaret asked, appearing at her side with a concerned expression. Julia shook her head. "Nothing, just a misunderstanding." But as the day progressed, Julia's anger began to give way to doubt. Had she overreacted? Yes, Ethan had omitted a significant detail about his life, but had he actually lied? She thought back to their conversations. He'd said he worked in shipping and logistics, true. He'd mentioned his company sometimes invested in promising ventures, also true. Even his comment about bureaucracy made sense for someone running a large corporation. By closing time, Julia's righteous anger had deflated, replaced by a hollow feeling in her chest. She'd pushed away the first man who'd made her feel truly seen in years, all because he hadn't volunteered his full job title. "You look like someone stole your favorite whisk," Margaret observed as they cleaned up the kitchen. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" Julia sighed, setting down the tray she was scrubbing. "I think Ethan is the CEO of Hartwell Industries." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "The man who's been coming in for coffee every morning is Ethan Hartwell." "The Ethan Hartwell," Julia nodded miserably, "and I just realized it today." "Did he tell you?" "No, that's the problem. He just said he worked in shipping and logistics. He never mentioned he owned the company." Margaret dried her hands on a towel, her expression thoughtful. "And this bothers you because he lied. Or at least he didn't tell me the whole truth." "Did you ask him directly what his position was?" Julia hesitated. "Well, no." "And did you tell him everything about yourself on your first date?" "That's different," Julia protested weakly. Margaret gave her a knowing look. "Is it?" "Ma chérie, when a man has wealth and power, people treat him differently. They want things from him. Perhaps he was simply waiting to know that you cared for him, not his position or his money." Julia felt a pang of guilt. Hadn't she jumped to the worst possible conclusion that he was playing some sort of game rather than considering he might have had good reasons for his discretion? I may have overreacted, she admitted. You think? Margaret said dryly. The way that man looks at you like you're a priceless work of art and you're upset because he didn't lead with hello, I'm a CEO. Put that way, Julia felt foolish. I should talk to him. You should, Margaret agreed, untying her apron, and perhaps listen this time. After closing the patisserie, Julia debated what to do. Should she call Ethan? Go to his office? As she stood on the sidewalk, uncertain, a sleek black town car pulled up beside her. The back window rolled down to reveal Ethan, his expression carefully neutral. May I give you a ride home? He asked formally. Julia nodded, her throat suddenly tight. The driver emerged to open the door for her, and she slid into the luxurious leather interior beside Ethan, acutely aware of the distance between them, both physical and emotional. They rode in silence for several blocks, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Ethan spoke. I owe you an explanation. Julia turned to look at him. In the dim light of the car, his face was all angles and shadows, his usual warmth concealed behind a mask of control. Yes, she agreed simply. You do. Ethan exhaled slowly. I am the CEO of Hartwell Industries. It was my father's company. I took over after he died. We control about 20% of the commercial shipping infrastructure in this country, along with interests in logistics technology, supply chain management, and venture capital. The clinical way he recited these facts made Julia realize how rarely he must talk about this aspect of his life in personal settings. I didn't tell you because. He continued, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. My position complicates relationships. People either want something from me, or they're intimidated, or they make assumptions about who I am based on what I do. With you, from the first day I walked into La Farine, it was different. You treated me like any other person. It was refreshing. The sincerity in his voice made Julia's resolve waver. But we've been seeing each other. You spent the night at my apartment. Didn't you think I deserved to know? Yes, he admitted. I was going to tell you. I just wanted to be sure that what was growing between us was real first. That you were interested in me, not what I represent. And you couldn't trust me to make that distinction, Julia asked, hurt coloring her voice. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she recognized. It's not about trust, Julia. It's about experience. My last serious relationship ended when I discovered she was more interested in my bank account than in me. Before that, I dated a woman who was so intimidated by my position that she could never relax around me. I just wanted a chance to be known for myself first. Julia was quiet, absorbing his words. Put in that context, his reluctance made sense, even if she didn't entirely agree with it. I understand why you did it, she said finally, but it still hurts to think you were hiding such a big part of your life from me. I never meant to hurt you, Ethan said, reaching for her hand. To his evident relief, she didn't pull away. And I wasn't hiding who I am, just what I do. Everything else I shared with you was real. My feelings for you are real. The car pulled up outside Julia's apartment building. For a moment they sat in silence, their joined hands a tenuous connection in the space between them. Would you like to come up? Julia finally asked. We should probably finish this conversation properly. Relief washed over Ethan's face. Yes, I'd like that very much. In her apartment, Julia made tea while Ethan stood awkwardly in her small living room, looking out of place in his expensive suit now that she knew who he really was. So, she said, handing him a mug and sitting on the sofa. Ethan Hartwell, CEO, tell me about him. Ethan sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. What do you want to know? Everything you didn't tell me before. Your real life. For the next hour, Ethan opened up about the reality of his position, the pressure of running a global corporation, the loneliness of leadership, the weight of responsibility for thousands of employees. He spoke about his father's legacy, his own vision for the company, and the challenges of maintaining his humanity in a cutthroat business world. The truth is, he concluded, I'm not very good at balancing work and personal life. Before I met you, there wasn't much to balance. Work was my life. Julia studied him thoughtfully. The man before her was still Ethan, the same man who had walked with her through the farmer's market, who had cooked dinner in her kitchen, who had held her through the night. The only difference was context. I wish you had trusted me with this sooner, she said softly, but I understand why you didn't. Ethan's eyes were hopeful as they met hers. Can you forgive me? Julia considered the question. Could she? The omission had hurt, but she could see now that it came from a place of self-protection, not malice. And hadn't she fallen for the man, not his position? Yes, she said finally. I can forgive you, but no more secrets, Ethan. I need honesty, even when it's complicated. Relief flooded his face. No more secrets, he agreed, reaching for her hand. I promise. Julia allowed him to pull her closer, settling against his chest with a sigh. So what now? She asked. Now that I know you're a powerful CEO and not just some guy who works in logistics, Ethan's arms tightened around her. Now we figure out what this is between us, day by day. If you'll give us that chance. Julia tilted her face up to his. I'd like that, she said softly when he kissed her. It felt like a new beginning, honest, open, and full of possibility. Over the next few weeks, Julia's world expanded in ways she never could have imagined. Ethan integrated her into his life with a quiet determination that both thrilled and occasionally overwhelmed her. She met his executive team at a company dinner, was introduced to his closest friends at a sailing excursion on his yacht, and even accompanied him to a charity gala where she found herself making small talk with the mayor and several celebrities. Through it all, Ethan remained attentive and supportive, always checking in to make sure she wasn't feeling out of her depth. When she admitted to feeling intimidated at the gala, he'd immediately whisked her away to a quiet balcony where they'd spent an hour talking and laughing, ignoring the glittering crowd inside. For his part, Ethan seemed to revel in the simpler aspects of Julia's life. He joined her and Margaret for staff dinners at the Patisserie, rolled up his sleeves to help with inventory, and even spent an entire Sunday helping Julia perfect a new recipe for salted caramel eclairs. His meticulous attention to detail proving surprisingly useful in the kitchen. One evening, about 2 months into their relationship, Ethan invited Julia to his home for the first time. She'd been curious about where he lived, but hadn't pushed, recognizing that he was gradually letting her into different aspects of his life at a pace that felt comfortable for both of them. His driver took them to a sleek high-rise in the most exclusive part of the city. As they rode the elevator to the penthouse floor, Julia felt a flutter of nervousness. This was Ethan's domain, a part of his life she hadn't yet seen. When the elevator doors opened directly into his apartment, Julia's breath caught. The space was spectacular, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, modern furnishings in shades of gray and blue, and an open-concept design that made the already large space feel even more expansive. This is. Wow, she managed, moving to the windows to take in the breathtaking view. It came with the job, Ethan said, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice as he watched her reaction. My father lived here before me. Julia turned to look at him. It's beautiful, but it doesn't feel very. You. Ethan raised an eyebrow. No, what feels like me? Julia considered the question. Warmth, books, comfortable places to sit and think. This feels like a showroom. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. That's exactly what my sister says. He took Julia's hand. Come on, let me show you the real part. He led her through the apartment to a door at the far end. When he opened it, Julia found herself in a completely different space, a cozy study lined with bookshelves, featuring a well-worn leather sofa, a desk cluttered with papers, and framed maps on the walls. A large window seat overlooked the city, piled with cushions and more books. This is where I actually live, Ethan admitted. The rest is for entertaining clients and maintaining the expected image. Julia moved into the room, running her fingers along the book spines, noting the eclectic mix of business texts, history, fiction, and travel memoirs. This feels right, she said with a smile. This feels like you. Ethan's expression softened as he watched her explore. I've never brought anyone in here before, he said quietly. It's always been my private space. The significance of his admission wasn't lost on Julia. This wasn't just Ethan showing her his home. It was Ethan letting her into the most personal part of his life, the sanctuary he'd created for himself away from the demands of his public persona. Thank you for showing me, she said, moving to stand before him. Ethan cupped her face in his hands. I'm falling in love with you, Julia Linden, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I have been since the first time I watched you pipe roses onto those eclairs, your face so focused you didn't even notice me staring. Julia's heart swelled. I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted. The real you, not the CEO, not the suit, just Ethan. When he kissed her, it felt like a promise of honesty, of vulnerability, of a future together they were only beginning to imagine. Later that night, as they lay tangled together in Ethan's massive bed, Julia traced patterns on his chest, her mind drifting. What are you thinking about? Ethan asked, his fingers playing with her hair. The future, she admitted. Us, how this works. Ethan shifted to look at her. What do you mean? Julia hesitated, trying to organize her thoughts. You're you, Ethan Hartwell, CEO of a global corporation. And I'm me, a pastry chef who works for someone else, who has student loans and a tiny apartment and a completely different life. I just wonder sometimes how those two realities fit together. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I don't have all the answers, he finally said, but I know that when I'm with you, everything else makes more sense. The work, the responsibility, the legacy, it all has purpose because at the end of the day, I get to come home to someone who sees me, not my position. His words warmed Julia's heart, but didn't entirely dispel her concerns. I don't want to lose myself in your world, she admitted. I love what I do. I love the patisserie, creating with my hands, the simplicity of it. I would never ask you to give that up, Ethan said firmly. Your passion, your talent, they're part of who you are, part of what I love about you. And what about my dream, opening my own patisserie someday? Ethan's eyes lit up. That dream is still yours to pursue however and whenever you want. I can help if you'll let me, but it's your vision, Julia. I just want to support you in making it real. The sincerity in his voice reassured her. Thank you, she said softly. I just needed to hear that. Always ask, Ethan said, pulling her closer. Always tell me what you're thinking, what you're worried about. The only way this works is with honesty. Honesty, Julia agreed, settling against him. I can do that. As winter settled over the city, Julia and Ethan's relationship deepened. They fell into comfortable routines, Sunday brunches at Julia's apartment, where she experimented with new pastry techniques. Evenings at Ethan's penthouse, where they would cook together or order in and talk for hours. And Ethan's daily visits to La Farine, now openly acknowledged as personal rather than just business. One snowy December evening, Ethan invited Julia to dinner at Terroir, the restaurant where they'd had their first date. When they arrived, Julia was surprised to find the entire restaurant empty except for their table, which was set near the fireplace and decorated with flowers. "Did you rent out the whole restaurant?" she asked, torn between amusement and embarrassment at the extravagance. "It's Antoine's night off anyway," Ethan said with a small smile. "I just asked if we could use the space." Throughout dinner, Julia noticed Ethan seemed slightly distracted, checking his watch and occasionally glancing toward the kitchen. When dessert arrived, a recreation of the rose eclairs she'd been making the first day he'd spoken to her, she finally called him on it. "Is everything okay? You seem nervous." Ethan set down his fork, his expression suddenly serious. "Julia, there's something I want to talk to you about." A flutter of anxiety tickled Julia's stomach. "That sounds ominous." "No, not at all," Ethan assured her quickly. "It's just I've been thinking about what you said about your dream of opening your own patisserie." Julia tilted her head curiously. "Yes, I found a space," Ethan said in a rush. "A perfect space for the kind of patisserie you've described. It's on Maple Avenue in that historic district you love. The building has character, big windows, and the previous tenant was a bakery, so most of the infrastructure is already there." Julia's eyes widened. "Ethan, before you say anything," he interrupted, "this isn't me trying to buy your dream or take control. I simply found the space. What you do with it, if you want it at all, is entirely your decision. If you want to wait, save up on your own, find your own space, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted you to know this opportunity exists." Julia was momentarily speechless. The location he described was indeed perfect, a charming neighborhood filled with independent shops, close enough to the business district to capture commuter traffic, but far enough away to have its own identity. "Can I see it?" she finally asked. Ethan's face brightened. "Now, of course." They left the restaurant and drove through the snowy streets to Maple Avenue. The storefront Ethan had found was on a corner with large windows and an inviting entrance. Even from outside in the dark, Julia could see the potential. "I have the keys," Ethan said, producing them from his pocket. "The real estate agent is a friend." Inside, the space was larger than Julia had expected, with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and a partially open kitchen that would allow customers to see the pastry-making process. It would need new equipment, a fresh design, but the bones were perfect. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, watching her reaction carefully. Julia turned slowly, taking it all in. "It's amazing," she admitted. "Exactly what I've always imagined." "It could be yours," Ethan said softly. "However you want to make that happen." Julia looked at him, understanding the delicacy of the moment. He was offering to help make her dream a reality, but was carefully leaving the terms of that help up to her, respecting her independence. "I'd need a loan," she said thoughtfully. "A business plan, suppliers, staff." Ethan nodded. "All things we can figure out. My company has a small business division that could provide the financing at fair market rates. No special treatment, just a legitimate business transaction. Or you could go to any bank, your credentials would qualify you for a loan." The care he was taking not to overstep touched Julia deeply. This wasn't a man trying to buy her affection or control her dreams. This was a partner offering support while respecting her autonomy. "I need to think about it," she said honestly. "It's a big step." "Of course," Ethan agreed immediately. "There's no rush. The space will be on the market for at least a month. Take all the time you need." As they stood in the empty storefront, snow falling gently outside the windows, Julia felt a surge of possibility. This could be her future, a place of her own, creating the pastries she loved, building something lasting. And beside her was a man who understood her dreams and wanted to help her achieve them, not for his own sake but for hers. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him. "Not just for finding this place, but for how you're approaching it, for understanding that it matters to me to do this my way." Ethan's eyes were warm as they met hers. "I love you, Julia. That means supporting your dreams, not replacing them with mine." The words, though they'd exchanged them before, still made her heart skip. "I love you too," she replied, stretching up to kiss him. As they stood in the empty space that might become her future patisserie, enveloped in each other's arms, Julia felt a certainty she hadn't expected. This was right, not just the space, but the man, the moment, the future they were building together. Over the next few weeks, Julia threw herself into creating a business plan for her patisserie. She spent her days working with Margaret, her evenings researching suppliers, equipment costs, and staffing requirements, and her weekends visiting other successful bakeries to understand their operations. Ethan supported her without overwhelming her, offering advice when asked, connecting her with industry contacts, but always careful to let the vision remain hers. When Julia decided to apply for a small business loan through a local bank, rather than through Hartwell Industries, he supported her decision completely. "It's important to me to do this as independently as possible," she explained as they sat in her apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets and sample menus. "I understand," Ethan assured her, "and I'm proud of you for being so thorough. This business plan is more detailed than some I see from established companies." In January, Julia submitted her loan application and signed a letter of intent on the Maple Avenue space, contingent on financing. 2 weeks later, she received the call she'd been waiting for. The loan had been approved. That night, Ethan took her out to celebrate. As they toasted with champagne, Julia felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. What if it fails? She voiced her deepest fear. What if no one comes? Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. "Then you'll adapt and try again. But Julia, you're brilliant at what you do. Your pastries are works of art. People will come." His confidence bolstered her own. "I gave Margaret my notice today," she said. She cried, then immediately asked if she could invest. Ethan's eyebrows rose. "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd think about it," Julia replied. "She's been so good to me. I'd like her to be part of this somehow." "She could be an advisor," Ethan suggested. "Her experience would be invaluable, even without a financial stake." Julia nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea." As winter gave way to spring, Julia's vision began taking physical shape. The space on Maple Avenue was transformed, walls painted a warm cream, new display cases installed, and state-of-the-art baking equipment arranged in the partially open kitchen. The sign above the door, "Julia's Patisserie," was hand-painted in elegant script. Through it all, Ethan remained her steadfast supporter, offering encouragement during moments of doubt, celebrating each milestone, and occasionally rolling up his sleeves to help with the physical labor of setting up the space. Julia was touched by how willing he was to get his hands dirty, his CEO persona completely absent as he assembled display shelves and painted walls alongside her. 2 weeks before the grand opening, as they sat on the floor of the nearly completed patisserie sharing a pizza, Ethan grew unusually quiet. "What's on your mind?" Julia asked, nudging him gently. Ethan set down his pizza slice, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about something and I want to run it by you." Julia raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." "Not at all," he assured her with a smile. "It's about us, our future." Julia's heart quickened. "I'm listening." "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life," Ethan began. "Watching you pursue your dream, supporting you through it, it's made me realize what I want for my own future." Which is, Julia prompted when he paused. Balance, he said simply. For years, I've let Hartwell Industries consume me. 18-hour days, working weekends, always available, always connected. Since meeting you, I've started delegating more, trusting my team, creating boundaries. Julia nodded. She'd noticed the change, how he now put away his phone during their time together, how he'd begun taking actual weekends off, how he seemed more relaxed, more present. I've realized that the company will survive without my constant attention, Ethan continued. In fact, it's thriving with the new leadership structure, and I've decided to make a more permanent change. What kind of change? Julia asked, curious now. I'm appointing Rebecca my assistant, though she's really been much more than that for years as chief operating officer. She'll take over day-to-day operations, reporting to me, but with significant autonomy. Julia's eyes widened in surprise. That's a big step. It is, Ethan agreed, but it's the right one. I'll still be CEO, still involved in major decisions and strategy, but I won't be in the weeds every day. I'll have time for other things. Important things. The intensity in his gaze made Julia's pulse quicken. Like what? Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Julia's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a stunning ring, a round diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light from every angle. Like building a life with you, Ethan said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. Julia Linden, these past months have shown me what truly matters. Your strength, your creativity, your integrity, you've made me a better man, a happier man. And I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, supporting your dreams as you've supported mine. He moved to one knee, still holding the open ring box. Will you marry me? Julia felt tears spring to her eyes, her heart so full it seemed it might burst. This man, this powerful, gentle, thoughtful man was choosing her, choosing a future where they built their dreams together. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, Ethan, I'll marry you. His face broke into a radiant smile as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the light as Julia flexed her hand to admire it. It's beautiful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It was my grandmother's, Ethan explained, rising to sit beside her again. The only woman in my family who managed to balance a successful career with a happy marriage. It seemed fitting. Julia threw her arms around him, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment, sitting on the floor of her soon-to-open patisserie, planning a future with a man who had walked into her life for a cup of black coffee and stayed to become her heart's home. I love you, she murmured against his neck. So much. I love you too, Ethan replied, holding her tightly. Always. 2 weeks later, Julia stood in the kitchen of her patisserie, surveying the final preparations for the grand opening. Display cases were filled with her most beautiful creations, rose eclairs, lavender madeleines, intricate fruit tarts, and delicate macarons in a rainbow of colors. The coffee machine was primed, the registers programmed, and the staff, 2 talented pastry chefs she'd hired from her culinary school network, were dressed in crisp uniforms bearing the patisserie's logo. At her left hand, her engagement ring caught the morning light, a constant reminder of the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. From a chance meeting over coffee to opening her own business and planning a wedding, all in less than a year. The bell above the door chimed and Ethan entered, carrying a large bouquet of flowers. For the most talented pastry chef in the city, he said, presenting them to her with a kiss. They're beautiful, Julia said, inhaling their fragrance. Thank you. Ethan looked around the space, pride evident in his eyes. Everything looks perfect. How are you feeling? Nervous, Julia admitted. Excited, ready. You're going to be amazing, Ethan assured her, squeezing her hand. This is just the beginning. At exactly 7 a.m., Julia flipped the sign from closed to open and unlocked the door. To her surprise and delight, a line had already formed outside curious locals, employees from nearby businesses, and even a few food bloggers who had caught wind of the opening. The first customer through the door was Margaret, beaming with pride. "Magnifique," she declared, looking around the space. "Absolutely magnifique. I knew from the moment I hired you that you were destined for greatness." The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity as Julia greeted customers, filled orders, and received countless compliments on her creations. By noon, several items had sold out completely, and the steady stream of customers showed no signs of abating. Ethan stayed in the background, helping where needed but careful not to overshadow Julia's moment. When a reporter from the local paper arrived to do a story on the new patisserie, he discreetly stepped outside, unwilling to let his presence and the inevitable questions about Hartwell Industries distract from Julia's achievement. It was late afternoon when the rush finally subsided enough for Julia to take a breath. She found Ethan in the small office at the back of the patisserie, responding to emails on his tablet. "Hey," she said, collapsing into the chair across from him. "We did it. We actually survived opening day." "You did it," Ethan corrected with a smile. "I just carried things and stayed out of the way." Julia shook her head. "I couldn't have done this without you. Not just the practical support, but your belief in me. It made all the difference." Ethan reached across the desk to take her hand, his thumb brushing over her engagement ring. "You would have found a way, Julia. You're the most determined person I've ever met, but I'm glad I could be part of the journey." As they sat together in the quiet office, the sounds of the patisserie customers chatting, coffee grinding, the bell above the door chiming created a pleasant backdrop. This was Julia's dream realized, and Ethan had helped make it possible, not by taking over but by supporting her vision every step of the way. "So, CEO Hartwell," Julia said with a mischievous smile, "now that I've successfully opened a business, any chance you might take an afternoon off to help me plan a wedding?" Ethan's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I think that can be arranged. My new COO insists I maintain a healthy work-life balance." "Smart woman," Julia observed. "I'd like to meet her someday." "You will," Ethan promised, "at the wedding, along with everyone else who matters to us." The thought of their future wedding, of officially joining her life with Ethan's, filled Julia with quiet joy. From that first morning when he'd ordered black coffee and her pastry recommendation, to this moment in her own patisserie, their journey had been unexpected but perfect. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't walked into La Farine that day?" Julia asked. Ethan considered the question. "I try not to," he finally said. "The thought of never knowing you, never experiencing this, is too bleak to contemplate." Julia nodded in agreement. "I guess sometimes the best things in life happen when we're not looking for them, when we're just going about our days, making pastries or drinking coffee. Or falling in love with the person behind the counter," Ethan added with a smile. As they leaned across the desk to share a kiss, the bell above the front door chimed again, another customer entering Julia's patisserie. Another small moment in the life they were building together, one cup of coffee and one pastry at a time. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day that mirrored the season when they'd first met, Julia and Ethan were married in an intimate ceremony in the garden of a historic estate outside the city. Surrounded by their closest friends and family, they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises of support, partnership, and enduring love. Julia's patisserie had flourished beyond even her most optimistic projections, developing a loyal following and receiving glowing reviews in local and national publications. Ethan's restructuring of Hartwell Industries had proved equally successful, allowing him the balance he'd sought while the company continued to thrive under shared leadership. As they danced under twinkling lights at their reception, Ethan held Julia close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Mrs. Hartwell," he murmured against her hair, "have I told you today how extraordinarily happy you make me?" Julia smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "Only about a dozen times, but I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you," Ethan said simply, "more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," Julia replied, "my coffee-drinking CEO who changed my life." As they moved across the dance floor, lost in each other's eyes, both reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had begun with a simple order: black coffee and the pastry of the day. From that first encounter, a busy pastry chef and her regular morning customer had grown a love story neither could have anticipated, but both now recognized as the greatest gift of their lives. And in the years that followed, as Julia's patisserie expanded to multiple locations, as Ethan continued to redefine success on his own terms, as they welcomed children who grew up understanding both the value of hard work and the importance of pursuing one's passions, they never forgot where it all began. With flour-dusted hands, a perfect cup of black coffee, and two hearts ready to recognize in each other exactly what they needed, even before they knew to look.